Yes.
So
Any more questions?
IPv6 and IPv4.
Yes. So you're asking the difference between IPv6 and IPv4?
IPv6
Sai,
only for subnet only.
can you please repeat your question, please? It was a
IP
little broken. Hmm.
yeah, IPv6 and IPv4 is there.
Hmm.
So we are using only IPv4. So what about
Correct.
IPv6? That's only for subnet purpose only, or we can use in public IPs also.
You can also use in public IP, meaning if you go into, let's say, the public IP addresses out here, and when I was creating a public IP address, I can also go and say that, I need an IPv6 address. So the IPv6 and the IPv4, the difference out here is that IPv6 is a wide range. When I'll say IPv6 example, a wide range of address. The address looks something like this. It's this big, which means that instead of the standard 32 bits of information, if I'm not wrong, you get somewhere around 128 bits of information to carry. Now, why IPv6 came into picture is very simple. IPv4s are getting depleted. Like, for example, I took an IP right now, which is a static assignment. Like me, there might be hundreds of customers across the world who are taking this particular IP, and these are limited in nature. That's the reason the industry is slowly moving towards IPv6s out here. But the transition, I would say, is not that rapid. You still have a lot of IPv4s that can be occupied, but a couple of, let's say, organizations are moving towards the IPv6 ranges. The range differs, but the underlying concepts are the same. That what is an IP address, what is static, dynamic, and all these things. It's just the address that kind of changes out there for you. So is it only for subnets? No, it is for any resource that can actually take that particular IP address as such.
Only range or anything.
Range and also the amount of information that you can carry inside the IP. Like for example, in IPv4, the maximum bits of information are 32. In an IPv6, if I'm not wrong, it is 128 bits of information out here. So the range, the amount of information that you can actually carry inside that kind of varies out there.
Scenarios are where we can use mostly
I'm sorry, can you come again, please?
in real-time scenarios
Mhm.
where we can use mostly the
Wherever you're using IPv4s. So where in my case, let's say I could have an IPv6 associated with my NIC card. In the place of, let's say, IPv4, I mean, instead of, let's say, going in with 20 something like that, I could have actually established connection with IPv6 address out there. So wherever that you're using an IPv4, you can actually substitute it with an IPv6 out there. Does it answer your question?
you can say as a advanced level of network, right?
I would say the next level of, or I would say the
Since
next
level. Okay.
generation of networks, or the next generation of IPs.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, but one thing that if you observe, like, anyone, if you observe this out, I have a virtual machine. I did all my associations right. So I said initially that, what, this machine doesn't have a public IP address. So we created a public IP address, and I now have a public IP address right now. So if I just refresh the screen, I have a public IP address out here that is associated with this. And if I copy this address, and if I'm going into this one and pasting the address and I'm saying connect, this is still not allowing me to go ahead and establish a connection. For some reason, even I'm not even able to talk to this particular public IP, meaning I am able to go ahead and establish a connection here, but this IP is not able to talk to this particular network interface. Meaning there is something that is blocking, there is someone who's blocking, nothing but my virtual network, wherein connections outside my network, meaning every connection that is coming outside my network. For example, this connection is coming from the public IP is getting blocked here. The public IP, when diverting that particular traffic, is getting blocked here because there is someone or something that is blocking this out. That someone something is your virtual network itself acting as a firewall, and it is blocking all your traffic out there. That's the reason we get one more resource into our architecture, which is called as a network security group rule. So let me see if I have a diagram. Yes, I am fortunate enough to find a diagram out here, which is called a network security group rule, which again gets associated with this particular subnet. Now, what is network security group rule? Very simple. This gives you a set of rules and tells how a virtual network should act, meaning what kind of a traffic is allowed inside the network and what kind of a traffic is allowed to go outside the network. You can say that this is like a firewall, which wherein you can go ahead configure multiple rules out here. That is where I'm getting into, and that rules will allow you to go ahead and start communicating with your machine, or the machine can start communicating with you both ways. So if I go again back into my resource group, if I now look at all the resources, I've just created one additional resource out here, which is demo IP address, which is inside the same resource group. But when I created the virtual machine, without me telling anything, it went ahead gave me something called as a network security group out here, NSG block. So let's get inside that. Let's see what exactly is there inside this NSG. Again, if I just get into the NSG, it is just it is just telling me that where it is associated with and all these things. So in my case, it is associated directly to the network interface card. I can also associate this with a subnet. We'll also talk about what is the association between network interface and the subnet out here. And I have something called an inbound rule and the outbound rules out here. In my case, what I'm trying to do is that as a user, I am trying to, let's say, go ahead and talk to the virtual machine over this, let's say, public IP. Sorry, not this one, over the public IP. And from here, I'm going inside, I'm trying to get inside the network and establish a connection with this particular VM. This is now called as an inbound connection. And for this inbound connection to work, I need to create something called as an inbound rule. Here, in the settings of my network security group rule, I have something called inbound security rules. And these are all the default rules. We'll come back to what a default rule and all these things. And I'll go ahead, add something called as a rule out here. In this, I will say the source can be anything, meaning it can be my IP address, your IP address, whoever it is, I'm okay with it. And the destination is any, meaning it can be anything within the network, but the service has to be something called as an RDP. I'm trying to establish a remote desktop protocol connection. And as and when I click on this, there is something known as a destination port range. And automatically, the value here became something known as 3389. What exactly do you mean by a port out here? Is that very simple. Every device that you work with, like let's say your printer or my laptop and etc., if they want to communicate with each other, they have channels of communication, and that particular channel of communication is called as a port. And by default, and each and every port will have its own number. So port is nothing but a channel, and each and every port will have its own number. And in my case, if I want to establish a RDP connection, this has to go through a channel called RDP that works at a number called 3389. Standard practice across the industry. You cannot say it is, I want to create my own port and work like an RDP. No, you cannot do that. In order to in order to establish this particular RDP, we say that you have to open the RDP port, which is 3389. And how do I open this? By adding a rule on my network security group out here. When I'm telling the destination is 3389, action is allow, and there is something called priority which I'll come down to, and I'll give a port a name called RDP allow. Can be anything out here, just giving a random name. I'll say add. Now this is creating something known as a security rule, and this is a rule that I am adding. This is a user defined rule, and all these things that you see out here are custom rules as such. And now it says, okay, fine, RDP allow is added, and the action here is to go ahead and allow this particular traffic, or allow the incoming traffic as such. And I have added the inbound port rule. I have added something called as the inbound security rule as such. So now what really happens is that if I take the same scenario, I'll say okay, and now if I say connect, automatically I'm being asked for some credentials, which means that the traffic is reaching to that particular virtual machine, and the virtual machine is responding back to you by telling, okay, fine, you are allowed, but can you please tell me what is the password? I'll give the password, the same password that I've set up while I was creating the machine, and it says, do you want to accept this connection? I'll say yes. And once I do this, it goes ahead and creates a session with my virtual machine out here. So this is my virtual machine. I can just minimize this out. If I click on this, I'm getting inside the machine out here. And since this is the first boot, this is the first time that I'm logging into, it will take some time to load this out. And now I am inside this machine, which is running out of an operating system called Windows Server 2016 out here. So this is how I, as a user, went ahead and I did a couple of things. I firstly created something called as a public IP address. I tried with the public IP, it did not work. Then I said that there is something called as a network security group rule that I need to configure. Because by default, your virtual network is going to kick off every traffic. Your virtual network is going to deny every traffic that is coming from the outside world, and I'm a user who's coming from the outside world. So in the network security group rules, I have added a rule telling that please open a port with a number called 3389, and this is called as an RDP, remote desktop protocol, and please allow this particular communication to go through. And after I have done that, I have used that particular RDP application, given my IP address and the password, and I'm now inside the machine. So I have now a virtual machine that is running from the Azure cloud to which I'm now communicating with. So this is how the architecture really looks like right now. These are all the components. So if I just need to review the components, VNet, the subnet, the NSGs, network security group rule, public IP addresses, the NIC card, and finally the virtual machine. And even when the machine got created, right, it would have followed the same order of creation. The virtual machine is the last resource, and finally you will have the disks also that is associated with the virtual machine out here. So this is now my entire architecture that goes inside the virtual machine as such. Yes, any questions to there? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till here?
Hi, Kiran.
Hi, sir.
Good, please. Good,
Hello.
Pawan.
Hello.
Just a second.
Actually,
Yeah.
actually, we are allocating space to the developers light virtual machine.
I wouldn't say. I mean, you can think of it in that concept, like allocating space to the virtual machine to the developers out there. You can think the concept in that way. But right now, I'm creating a virtual machine so that I can convert this virtual machine into a web application server. I'm doing it in that way.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Any more questions?
Hi, sir.
Good, please.
Sir, as you created network security rules,
hmm
is these rules also created by contributor or rules, sir? Contributor
yes,
user?
you can. Yes, you can do a. I mean, you if you are a contributor user, you can go ahead and also go ahead and create that particular network security group rules and etc.
Yes.
Or if you need a specific role out there, you can say something called as a network contributor and all these things out, and you can go ahead with that with that as such.
Hi Kiran.
Mhm.
Here we are creating NSG group.
Mhm.
Firewall and NSG group is same or different? If
No, it
same,
is
what is
different.
the
No, it is
okay?
different. Firewall is different, and then NSG group rule is different. Now, firewall is called as a stateful resource. NSG is called as a stateless. We'll talk about that when we go into the concept of firewalls as such. So when I cover firewall, I'll just to show you the difference between what really firewall is and what, let's say, an NSG, and how firewall can work better than an NSG out there.
Okay, we created in a NSG group allow the RDP. At
Mhm.
that time, we created Denny the RDP, which will take the first. It will comes first.
Good question. When you create the NSG and when you, let's say, go ahead, you went ahead and did something called allow RDP. If you do a deny RDP, then which will take a priority? It depends upon the priority that you allocate to something. If I say deny RDP out here, so if I add a rule and I'll say again the service is RDP, and this time around I'll deny this out, and let's say I have a priority called 120, 120, and I'll say this is deny RDP. Always and always, Azure considers the rule with the least priority number, and no two rules can have the same priority number out here. So if you are looking at this particular architecture, and if I am looking at your problem case scenario, one is allow, the other is deny. In this case, allow is given the higher order of priority because it has a lower number, and you can still go ahead and talk to your virtual machine out here. So allow will take a greater, let's say, order of priority as such, and this is controlled by the priority number that you give to a rule while creating the same on the network security group. And no two rules can have the same order of priority as such. Yes, does that answer your question? Is it possible to modify, let's say, the NSC rules? Yes, it is possible to modify the NSC. Correct, it is. Okay, to answer to one of the questions in the chat, firstly, it's not Bastion, it's Bastion. So that's a different thing. That's a different concept altogether. So it's called BASTION, Bastion. And SSH for Linux, yes, SSH for Linux. We'll talk about Linux operating system. I'm not touching that right now. Bastion not required a public IP. No, you also require a public IP that is associated to a Bastion host. So Bastion is altogether a different concept out there. You still need a public IP, but that public IP doesn't have to be associated with your virtual machine. That gets associated with something called as a Bastion host, which I do not want to take it right away because it'll end up confusing a lot of people if I go there. So Bastion is altogether a different concept, which will act like a public IP, I would say, but you don't have to, let's say, use the RDP application in your, let's say, system that is installed. You can directly go into a browser and, let's say, establish a connection with it. So boils down to the same concept out there. You still need a public IP. You cannot, let's say, ignore that particular public IP out there. But Bastion host is, let's say, a little bit of advanced way to go ahead and create a connection with your virtual machine as such. Yes, any more questions here? Specific to, let's say, NSGs or public IPs or anything that you do not follow. So again, please try to, let's say, draw your own diagram, whether it's in a notebook or something like this. The reason that I'm, let's say, focusing upon this architecture and again is that when we are trying to automate things, meaning, let's say, in the coming classes we'll also try to, let's say, create the virtual machines using automation. When we are trying to create it using automations, we'll have to understand the order of creation, like which resource depends upon what. And if I want to, let's say, create multiple virtual machines at one go, then how many multiple resources that I need? Do I need multiple public IPs? Do I need multiple NICs? Do I need multiple subnets? What is it? And in that way, we go ahead and, let's say, try to create things out here. Yes. Any questions here that I can take? Again, if you look at the pace again, guys, I've reduced it a lot. I'm going through in a very slow pace. Reason being, see, some of y'all might be from a networking background, some of y'all might not even know what is a network. So I, as a facilitator, have to make sure that everyone is on a common platform, and once that is established, we can go ahead and, let's say, interact with the advanced concepts like load balancing, like VPN concepts and all these things. So I'm just introducing the basics as of now, and once we are done with the basics, we'll go into advanced level of networking and understand what really network is and all these things out here.
Uh, I have one question regarding how can we pull the data in a command line regarding
Mhm.
all the resources that are associated to the with this virtual machine.
All the resources that are associated with this particular virtual machine. So when you say all the resources that are associated with this particular virtual machine over a command line, what you
Yes, yes.
can do is that there's a command called get hyphen az vm. Very
Okay.
simple command which goes ahead, gets the virtual machine, not only the virtual machine, but also all the associated properties of a virtual machine, like the resource group name, the virtual machine ID, the network interface card that is associated with, and all these things.
Mhm.
So you get an entire block, and you can now
Okay.
go ahead filter out with this particular block and get, let's say, all the resources that are associated with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Any more questions here?
I mean, secure.
Mhm. I'm sorry. Your voice. I'm not sure, but I'm not able to hear your voice. Um, guys, can you all hear my voice? Just trying to check whether my network is okay. Can anyone please tell
Yes,
me?
yes, yes.
Yes, sir.
So some issue at your end, and let's see. How to give username in a remote desktop connection. So when I do a remote desktop connection, so I'll just come back from there. I'll say it is remote desktop. I'll give firstly the IP and then say show options. Here I can go ahead, say it is test user and whatever it is, and I'll say connect. So I can go ahead and give that particular connection. And since I've already established a connection, it won't, let's say, it will deny me again because the same laptop is trying to establish two different connections out there. But you can give the IP, and here you had something called more options, and click on that particular more option, and you get a place or you get a provision to go ahead and give your IP address out here. Oh, sorry, give your username out here. And once you do that, it'll next page it'll also ask you go ahead and give something called as the password. You can go ahead give your password and establish a connection with that particular machine as such. This is how we go ahead and
Which password you have to give, Kiran?
the password you while you're creating the machine. So
Yeah,
basically,
virtual machine.
exactly.
Hello.
So when you create the machine, you went ahead give a password, right? Username
Yeah,
and the password. So the same password you'll have to give it out here.
yeah. Username also same you have to give.
Yes, username also is the same thing. So yesterday I gave a username called test user and a password associated with it. And today I'm just
Okay,
reusing the same test user and the password that I have with that.
okay.
What is the difference between a VM and an on-premise server? Good question. VM is something is a resource that is running on Azure. You don't really have to buy a server. You don't really have to, let's say, go ahead buy your own server configuration out here. And when you say on-premise, that is something that you can see. That is something that you can interact with, which is there in your site. Meaning you buy a big server out there, install hypervisor, do all the maintenance by yourself, and then go ahead and, let's say, start connecting to it. In my case, a virtual machine is running on top of an on-premise server, but the on-premise server is something that I haven't purchased. So virtual machine is just a small application that is running on-premise. Sorry, virtual machine is something that is running on-premise, and on top of that particular on-premise server, I've just installed this particular software out here. But when you actually look at, let's say, on-premise out there, it is something that you have to buy from a provider, like a vendor, like, let's say, Dell or someone like that. And Harish is asking a question: if I forget the username and password, where do I find it in the portal? The problem is you don't find it in the portal. You cannot find it in the portal. But what you can do is that you can reset it out. If you forget your passwords, going to the virtual machine out here, just say reset password. You can go here and give your username password. Just hit the update button, and you can reset it out. You cannot get your old password out here. If you forget, you forget. That's it. Yes. Any more questions here?
Sorry, I got disconnected earlier.
Yes.
I was asking like, can we pull out the details like the network rules also?
Yes, you can pull the details like network rules. So for that, what you need to do is firstly you'll have to understand what is a network security or network security group that is associated with this particular VM, and
Okay.
then do a get hyphen AZ network security group, and then get all the group rules out there. You can
Okay.
also
Okay.
get that. You can also set it, and you can do a lot of things out there.
Okay.
Is public IP same from for the entire virtual network? If it is AME, how is it connecting to a specific VM? No, it is not same for the entire network. It is specific. Public IP is specific to one particular resource called as a virtual machine out here. If you have another virtual machine, then probably you will create one more, let's say, IP address out here, and that particular virtual machine will have its own network interface, and then that's how you will communicate with the next virtual machine as such. So public IP is not the same across the network. It is specific to a particular resource called as a virtual machine as such out here. Yes, any more questions here that I can take? Anyone? Any more
The
questions here?
network interface, it will use for the production environment when we use the static, right? Dynamic to static, it will use in production
It
environment only.
depends upon not only production. In non-productions also, you can go ahead and put it as a static. It just depends upon what is the use case scenario that you're actually trying to, let's say, resolve out here. Because when you say it is production, then I also need to understand how is it actually working in production. Is that particular configuration really working in production? So I need to replicate the same thing in a non-production environment to test all my changes out there. So not only production, you can also have a static IPs in non-production as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, any more questions here? Okay, so the agenda today, guys, is that try to just create the entire resources. Try to map all the resources that you see out here in my screen, and try to, let's say, create your own diagram to understand how one resource is connected to each other, and try to give multiple rules out here. When you go into NSE, just go ahead, give multiple rules, see how they work in combination with each other, and just try to establish an RDP connection with the server. And in tomorrow's session, we'll see what I can do after creating an RDP session, what will exactly happen, and how do I convert this particular machine into a web server, and what I can do, and all those things out there. So this is the area that I want to slide into from tomorrow's session. And if there are any more questions, I'll take it before tomorrow's class. We'll answer that, and we'll go through the session out there. So I'll mark an end to the session. So have a good day ahead, guys, and we'll meet tomorrow, and we'll discuss more on this. Thank you.